Hello and welcome back to What I'm Playing Plus, a sort of supplementary podcast that goes alongside the main What I'm Playing show. This is the second part to what I released. Was it last week? Well, last week at the time of recording, uh, where I spoke about my favorite games that I've played this year in terms of my backlog. And because I spoke so long, I ended up cutting a lot of this kind of extra stuff out. But also, it sort of, in hindsight, gave me more time to kind of play some of these. Well, I say some of these games. Primarily, one of the games, in the hopes of finishing it. But still, I have not finished that game, and that's Final Fantasy 16. Um, I'll get to that at the end, but I'm also sort of considering maybe I will leave a dedicated sort of podcast to fully talk about that. I'm kind of not too sure. I was kind of like, do I delay this? I was like, well, I don't know. I sort of promised, I sort of said that like I would have this done for this week or next week, so I thought I'll do it, and there'll be plenty of times whether it's on the next show or whatever to talk about Final Fantasy, or if I do like a dedicated show specifically to that. And yeah, so the plans for that are kind of just in flux, pretty much. Like I don't quite know what I'm going to be doing regarding that. So we'll just see. I'll just see how I kind of feel and how things go. Obviously, if you've listened to, I think I sort of spoke. I kind of spoke about this in particular on the most recent What I'm Playing episode, but also you would kind of have an idea of what I was going to talk about. I sort of think if you were listening to the last What I'm Playing Plus episode, since this particular show, the one I'm doing now, is effectively the second part to that, and I think ultimately I don't see the ending of Final Fantasy really changing my thoughts on the game. I think it's kind of, I'm pretty set on what I feel in the game. But we'll get to that right at the end because I've written these in order of when they've kind of like release, also when I've played them. Um, and I think, yeah, by the end you'll be able to sort of tell which games kind of stood out most to me. But let's get into the show. Of course, if you're new, if you got any questions, you got any feedback, be sure to leave that in the comments and everything. And be sure to check out the other podcast episodes I've done. We've spoken about a lot of things recently, and with a lot more already to talk about. I think this week there's been a couple of news stories I've already written down I want to talk about in the next episode, so that'll be interesting. But for now, let's get into this. So the first game that I'm thinking about, for which I think this is certainly like higher up on the list in terms of, if we're talking like ranking wise, this is probably close to, this is like a proper game of the year contender for me, and that's the Dead Space remake that released in, I believe it was January. I think it was like, I want to say January like 17th, like 20 something, but it was sort of, second half of January. Um, and I honestly just think that this game is nothing short of perfect. Honestly, it is. I had never actually played the original Dead Space, and I played that on Xbox a few weeks before this remake. And in the past I had played Dead Space 2 and 3 on PS3, and then, but yes, I never got around to Dead Space 1. I actually do own Dead Space 1 on PS3, but I got it later on, and then it was a pre-owned copy, and then by that point I think I was on PS4 and I just never went back. And so yeah, the Xbox version I played earlier this year was actually the first time I played the very first game, and then obviously I had to play this remake. But like, to me, this remake is pretty much exactly what I think a remake should be or can be. Like, it's weird because like I like what Resident Evil's done with their remakes, and I like what Final Fantasy VII's done with its remake, where it's effectively a different game. Like it might follow the same kind of story and setting and characters, but yet it's like totally different. Whereas to be fair, this Dead Space remake doesn't quite do that. But to me, I don't know what you really could do with Dead Space that could, because I think a lot of it's like, you could even, like, I was just thinking now is like, oh, you could do first person, but one of the coolest things about Dead Space is the way that like the HUD and everything isn't on the screen. It's on like Isaac's, who plays Isaac Clarke, the main character, on his sort of suit on his back is like, it displays your health and your ammo is shown when you sort of aim and stuff like that. There is actually, I always get confused whether it's diegetic or non-diegetic, but there's one of those types of like user interfaces that's to do with the fact when it's not on the screen and it's in the world kind of thing, so like characters can see it. And they do, and characters do refer to it as well in the game. So it's a really cool thing like that. So you could do stuff like it with first person, but it wouldn't have, I don't think, the same effect because the suit was such an iconic part of Dead Space. Just like the color, like just like the design of it and the colors and obviously things like that. And I think you would, yeah, it wouldn't be very good trying to change it to an FPS. And so it's one of those where I just don't think you really need to change it. and I don't think it was worth changing. And I think that the fact is that, you know, this remake is sure, like some might say, like, because I like some will say that, if you played the first game, like the original, you don't need to play this, and I think that's mostly true. But at the same time, to me, even with a couple of weeks or however long it was beef between playing them, there was a lot about this remake that I didn't recognize or that seemed different. And and like, for example, like like in terms of actual lighting as well, it's a lot darker, it's a lot more of a horror sort of, it feels, I think, more like a horror game than the original did. That the original has its moments, but I think in hindsight, like, it doesn't. To me, a lot of people would say it holds up. I don't know if I entirely agree. I think it holds up as a game, like it plays well and everything, but I just don't know if it really, it was probably scarier when it came out than it is now. But this remake really does kind of uh feel like it kind of commits to that a little bit more. um, and it's cool because they what's interesting is that it's not like they don't do anything new, because they actually add on a bunch of I think most of the weapons and the upgrades that you have, I believe, are new for the first game. They are pulling from the second game, but they are, you know, new for the first game, basically. And I really enjoyed the first, like, Dead Space 2 when I first played that, and that's kind of, I've always kind of said that Dead Space 2 is one of my favorite games. I think I don't really know if, like, it's been years and years since I've actually played it, so, but I just, something about that world and the way everything looked, and even as someone like myself who's not super into like horror games, to me that was a lot more of an appealing horror game than like Resident Evil has been. Not to say I don't like Resident Evil, because Resident Evil, there's actually a lot about Resident Evil I like as well. Um, but just to me, Dead Space is kind of sci-fi world, and the kind of weapons that you have very iconic. Stuff like the plasma cutter is such a very iconic weapon. Um, so yeah, I was really sort of blown away by this remake, because I was sort of, to see uh I like, when games get remade, or when you see like, oh, we're bringing back this franchise, oftentimes it's not like the original dev team. You don't really know who's behind it. It doesn't mean there's no one from the original dev team on. It doesn't mean they didn't go back for, like, they didn't do any research. But to me, this remake is so perfect. Like, it's not only just a great game by itself, but it's just a really strong remake. It's, like, you could compare it to like The Last of Us Part 1, like, because that got its remake. But the thing with Last of Us Part 1 is it's literally the same. It's just graphics. There's a few extra like unlockable stuff, but it's like, beyond that, it's effectively, like, you don't really gain much from playing like the remake over the original or the remastered version on PS4. Whereas this, I feel like you can play the first Dead Space and you can play the remake, and even if they're very similar and they kind of follow a lot of the story, there's a lot of new stuff in there, and they change a lot of, like, set pieces and moments to fit, to try something else or whatever. And there's even, like, you've got kind of side quests in there. You've got, obviously, Isaac's got a voice actor now. Some of the dialogue's different. Um, but generally they keep everything just the same. It's one of those things where it's faithful in every way it needed to be. It, as a game, it plays and feels exactly how one I remembered it, but probably more refined with like better animations and stuff. um and then they've also added some new stuff that's kind of added on, additive to everything, that doesn't feel like it detracts from the experience. It's optional a lot of the time, so you don't even need to engage with it. And it just creates this, like, it's honestly, like, to me it's masterful, honestly. Like, I think this is, I'm shocked, especially because, like, there was a bit of a sort of like a worry, like, oh, are they gonna execute on this the right way? And they did, like, significantly, like, way. Like I said, it just sincerely, I think it's probably the best remake I've played. It's not, again, it's not like it's changing as much as, say, like Final Fantasy VII does, or, which, not that I've fully played that, but from what I know of that, and same with Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4, it doesn't have as much like evolution from, like, oh wow, look, this was this 1998 game, and look at it now in 2018 or whenever Resident Evil 2 came out, you know and it's like a third person, like, it's super graphical, and it's third person shooter, not kind of, like, not fixed camera angles, and And there's a lot of merit to that for sure, but to me, Dead Space is just this remake is just it's exactly what I wanted. I think it's exactly what it needed to be, and yeah, I just think it is. It's the best remake I've played. I just think this is like a truly special game, and I'm like really hoping they go on a remake 2. And I think what'll be really interesting is if they remake 3, because they probably have to make more changes there to kind of maybe. But it's weird because a lot of people didn't like 3 because it was less of a horror game. It was more of like an action game, which I didn't hate because like to me I kind of that's I like the kind of like getting weapons, upgrading them, things like that. And I sort of think that if you're going to remake 3, you can make it more of a horror game, but I also think that you should probably still try and achieve what they went for before. Like, maybe keep co op, maybe keep these things. And it doesn't have to be suddenly like you're changing into a horror game, like, entirely. I think part of what makes remakes cool is, in a way, is retaining the essence of what made it. Or if you're not going to, at least having the original to play there, which obviously none of the Dead Space games you can play at least on PS4 and 5. Uh, so I'd be curious to know what they do there, but I think that once you get through that then you can go on and do a Dead Space 4, and you can kind of maybe carry this on, or you can reboot it, kind of thing, like officially, if you wanted to. And so, yeah, I just think this remake's really good, and I just think that after this, they should definitely continue. And I think they're making an Iron Man game now, I think, which is a bit of a shame, because I hope that doesn't mean that the Dead Space 2 remake might be far out, unless EA just didn't think it was popular enough or something, or didn't do as well. I hope that's not the case, because I think that this is a truly special remake, and uh, I would at least like them to do the same with 2 and 3. And again, especially if they're going to kind of do what they did here, where they keep the essence, they keep a lot of what made it great, and then they evolve it at the same time. So yeah, I would highly recommend the Dead Space remake, because I think it's one of the best games I played this year, and I think it's certainly, like I said, my favorite remake, and I think it's very high quality. And so yeah, I fully recommend. And especially if if you're into horror or anything like that, you should 100% go and check out Dead Space remake. So next here, I've got the Resident Evil 4 remake, which is we're jumping from one remake to another remake. Uh, this took me a bit of time to get through. I can't actually remember why. I think something else released around the same time, or something was going on. So I remember sort of playing it when it came out, and then not really getting back to it for another week or two properly. Um, but it's weird. This one I want to replay, because when I think back to like how it was when I was playing it, there was a lot I like about it. It's not, this isn't like, I do think this is a good game. I guess this is meant to be my favorite games of the year, and so I think it still clarifies, like, it's still, I still play this and I'm like, yeah, this is a pretty high quality game. This is one of the best I played this year. But I think this is almost on the lower end to a certain extent, because I again, this is why I want to replay it, but I feel like Resident Evil 4 Remake was a little bit held back by being on last gen. I think visually there are times where it looks really good, and then other times where it almost looks muddy and not great. Um, and I sort of just feel like this would have been really just if they had just kind of given it a bit more time and has focused on this being like a PS5 game. Now I guess that it might not have worked out like that properly, because I guess when it started development, it probably was, you know, close to the release of the PS4, but that was, at the time of release, that was just over 2 years beforehand. So, I guess like you couldn't suddenly scale it up significantly, but if they've been working on it for just say 3 years, I don't know if that's, I mean, I don't know how long they've been working on it, but they got the Resident Evil 2 and 3 and the fourth remake out pretty quick. So, also, I actually said earlier, Resident Evil 2, I think, came out in 2019. I said 2018, but I think it was 2019. And then Resident Evil 3 was 2020, and then this was 2023. But in that time, they've had Resident Evil 8 as well, which I think was 2021. And so, again, I don't know how it works for Capcom, but it sort of just, they must have made this in a pretty short time, and it's good for what it is, and it's an impressive remake, and it's a lot of, like, I think when I look back, I think I prefer this over the original in many ways, and I think I would play this over the original. um it's similar to Dead Space. It kind of does that thing of like keeping a lot of the essence, but also it also adds a lot of new stuff. It cuts out certain things, and I think overall it's probably a better paced game, but it also tries some new things that I don't think, Well, it tries attempts at what the original did, and then it also tries new things as well. Um, and so one of these is the context sensitive parries and dodges. So one thing you can do in this remake, which is really funny and crazy and wild and just awesome, just it totally plays. It's like Resident Evil 4's like just like how it's more of a like a it's got a very campy nature about it, sort of thing. It's very exaggerated and over the top and things like that. And so being able to like parry enemies with a knife and then like kick them is just such a it's really satisfying, and the animations and everything are really cool, and the way that feeds into combat is a really cool flow that you certainly didn't get from the original. You got sort of elements of it, you know, in the original, but not in as fluid a way as you do in this remake. But kind of extended beyond that, you also have, much like in the original, when an attack is coming in your direction, sometimes you, because there's no dodge or anything, you have to press like a button prompt that comes up on the screen. And I think in this one it might be like circle or something like that. I don't know if you have to, but I think in the original you had to press like square and X or something like that. It was like a two button thing. But here they made it just one button. But this actually is like, to me, I think there's a pretty big issue with this in particular. Like, I think it's a glaring issue, and it kind of shocks me that this wasn't tried to iron out a little bit. So I don't quite understand why they decided to take away the dodge from Resident Evil 3. I saw, like, looking online, some people were saying, oh, it would have made it too easy. But it's like, yeah, but there's ways that you can make it, you know, less difficult, or, you know, not be as sort of easy to use and everything. Um, or kind of like make it so that if you're going to use it, you kind of get penalized for it. So you're not just kind of you're not just doing it all the time, just and you're dodging all these attacks, like, you know, and it becomes, you know, easy. But there are ways you can do it where it sort of you know, wouldn't allow you to just spam it, kind of thing. But essentially what they do is you can get, like, if an enemy, so like say if an enemy's like attacking in your direction, and it'll give you the prompt to dodge, you can press that, and as long as you press it at the right time, then you'll dodge and you'll be fine. But the way I understand this in terms of how it's implemented in the game is that obviously every attack that comes in has a radius, you know, like if you imagine it like a cone or like an area of effect sort of thing, it's gonna, if they're attacking forward and they're swinging in from the right, it's probably gonna have a cone that's kind of like rounded, and then as it kind of like goes out and then in as they bring their arm around, kind of thing. Um, and if you imagine that with every attack that an enemy has that you can dodge, that will also, that sort of cone will also be the area in which the prompt appears, you know, so that it can like let you know, like, you know, the prompt is basically saying you need to press this, otherwise if you don't, you're going to get hit by this incoming attack. And so it's kind of meant to be a quick reaction kind of thing. The problem I found I ran into, and this could be my, like, a problem with my, like, myself, where it was that I was running into combat. Maybe I was being playing too close quarters too much. I don't really know. I don't know. Maybe I should have taken more of a, you know, kept the distance. Though there was the one boss fight, not to get too spoilery, but the one boss fight in the barn that's burning, I thought was not a very good boss fight at all. I thought there was so many weird sort of awkwardness with that fight that just they very similar to this, and it was very punishing on like timing and things like that. And I was sort of kind of surprised by it, and it took a bit of time to get through, and I couldn't really understand why. Again, like, it felt kind of awkward, and I think that's just how Resident Evil games are, because it's like, oh, they kind of make you slower, they make you feel like they kind of make it feel clunky, but sometimes I think it's almost to the game's detriment, where it kind of feels like, hang on a minute, you're trying to make me feel like I'm this campy, you know, it's crazy over the top, and yet now I'm like running around and getting, you know, held up because I'm having, you know, because I'm like, oh, I haven't dodged that properly. But um yeah, so say if an attack's incoming and you're stood in that cone, it's going to give you the prompt, but if you drop out of that cone just as you go to press the button, well, you're not going to activate the prompt, and what you're instead going to do is crouch, because that's on circle. And so what happens is that you move out of it, you crouch, your mind is thinking, oh, I'm pressing this at the right time, I'm going to dodge this attack. But what actually happens is you don't dodge the attack, you crouch, and then you're suddenly slowed in movement. So then, at least for me, it took like a moment or two to kind of like recalibrate and work out, like, oh shit, like, I haven't dodged that, I need to move now. And what happens is, I think there's that moment, you've got to think in the split second, you're talking, this attack is probably giving you 2 or 3 seconds to react, and this was all happening in this short window. And if you accidentally slip back into that cone again, you might have like, you know, like 0.2 seconds to like press the button. But if you don't, which oftentimes because it's again it's a 2 or 3 second wind up for this attack that you've got to dodge. You kind of like, I've missed it, and then you get killed in like one hit or whatever. And the same thing can kind of happen with like the knife parry, where it's like you've got to parry at the right time. Um, and if obviously if you don't, then you get killed either in one hit or you take a lot of damage or whatever. And there's just several things like this. There's like especially like the whole idea of like, oh, a button is required for one thing, that then what can happen is sometimes you can accidentally um, press that button uh, just as something else, just as you miss the prompt for that button, and then you end up creating, another action plays because you've obviously got two actions on one button. One's a prompt, one's waiting for a prompt. The other one is just like, and like so like in this example, circle is the prompt button for the dodge, but also it's crouch. And yeah, and so then what happens is sometimes that can lead you to getting like taking a ton of damage, or you can just get killed in one hit. And I ran into this several times, and to be honest, I was like, maybe it's my fault, but it's like, but I probably like it shouldn't be my fault really, because the game has that in there for the reason, and I'm just surprised they didn't add a bit of a forgiving delay that like if you're in that cone you slip out of it, but you still press circle, even if the prompt is gone, as long as you press circle and you're within a split second of that prompt disappearing, I feel like the game could easily just count you in and just kind of and I think that a little bit of polish could have been done there just to kind of make those feel a little bit more. I don't want to say forgiving in a way to make it easier, but forgiving in a way that just makes it feel fairer, because that's what happens is it becomes feeling like the game's being unfair, you know, and it kind of takes away from the game having its moment of like, wow, I'm parrying enemies with my knife and this is crazy, but it kind of feels like, maybe that's not like a proper fighting style here, but it's not even like I was doing that very often kind of thing. But what can also happen is like sometimes I've had it where it's like the prompt has appeared, I've pressed the button, and either I feel like it hasn't activated. I don't know if that's because I've slipped outside of the cone, or if that's like, for example, like Leon will just like he'll so like when you press L1, L1 is like your parry button, but it's also like you can hold L1 to kind of like aim with your knife, and you can then press R2 to like jab forward kind of thing. So it's almost like you're preparing an attack kind of thing. And sometimes I've had it where it's like the prompt for L1's come up and I've pressed L1 and it hasn't done that thing, but it's instead made me aim. And I think what happens is that it's more like you press it, but you have to be waiting and press it as the enemy attacks. So it's almost like the game is giving you a prompt to let you know that it's incoming, but if you press it too early, you just have to kind of like press it at the right time, even though it's giving you the prompt. Like a prompt should be like saying, when you press this button, a thing is going to happen, you know? And it seems like what happens is it's just telling you what button you need to press because you're about to be attacked by something. And I don't know if that's the same for these other attacks, these dodging attacks, but often what I would sometimes do is I would literally, if I think I'm going to get hit by an attack, I start spamming circle, and so Leon's crouching and standing, and I'm just like, this, why am I doing this? Like, it's almost, and I think, as I said, maybe I just need to spend more time away from combat, but there's things like this that I'm just like, I am really shocked. Like I remember Resident Evil 2 remake being kind of awkward, but the difference is that game has a very simple understanding of when you get grabbed and when you don't. If you get grabbed, you're gonna take damage, and there's very few one hit attacks I think in that game, other than from like bosses or whatever. I think. But if you have like a grenade, whether it's a frag or a flash grenade, you can press that as a counter or whatever, and that's your way of getting out of the enemy, getting out the enemy's sort of grab. And so it's to me it's like I just think they should have stuck with the dodge mechanic, and they should have let you had it from like keeping it from Resident Evil 3, but just limiting it in some way, or making it so that when if you double tap circle you automatically roll, and just adding some iframes, and it's like maybe it's unrealistic, but it's like I don't know, like a lot of the game is unrealistic. Like can we it's not like Resident Evil's like super serious and super yeah, realistic all the time, So I think you could have got away with stuff like that. And I as I do want to go back to it, but stuff like that really grinds on me because I'm like, how does everything else feel so good, but yet this other thing feels like it's such a glaring issue. And I'll be honest, I've not seen really anyone talk about this kind of thing. I know there's a YouTuber called The Gaming Brit Show who did a review on the game and mentioned kind of not about the specific dodge thing, but he mentioned about the kind of prompts and the pressing, that they're tied to two different buttons. They're tied to an action on the controls all the time, and then they're tied to a prompt that's giving you. Um, so yeah, this was just like kind of a thing. I've gone on ages about this particular thing because I've not really spoken too much about the entire thing. But it stands out to me kind of thing. It's like I think back, and another thing that stands out is Um, they try and do stealth gameplay as well, and I promise I will go on some positives in a minute. I'm not just like constantly going on about like these negatives because there's a lot of things I like about it. Um, but they give you the option of stealth, making it seem like it's this really viable way that you can play, and it kind of ends up not being that at all because what happens is you'll have things where it's like enemies will randomly detect you and you'll be like, how have I been seen? And the game won't give you any indication of who's seen you, how you've been seen, or anything like that. So you have no idea. And a lot of the time it's inconsistent where it's like sometimes like I was having points where I was literally sneaking up behind an enemy, stealth killing them right in front of another enemy, and they didn't react at all. And they had other times where I did it, and they were way far out, and they saw me like all the way, and I was like, this simply doesn't make sense. And it's like things like that where it's like, okay, sure, like when we compare it to Dead Space, it's like Dead Space Remake tries some stuff, but it's either optional or it doesn't kind of get in the way. And oftentimes it just pays off and it feels well kind of conjoined with the entire game. But these some of these things like the stealth and the prompts and the dodging and stuff like that feels like weird choices to make when it's not really implemented in the right ways, and it kind of feels like it detracts it a little bit because what happens is it's the game telling you you can do something and then you try and do it and then it doesn't work, you know. Like to me, I like stealth in games, you know. I think of like, you know, it's like The Last of Us, for example, like that you can play a lot of it in stealth, and but that game has a very clear understanding, I think, of when, and sometimes Last of Us can be weird. I remember Last of Us having weird points where it's like, oh, how have I been seen? But a lot of the times you can kind of work it out, you know. And in Resident Evil, I was like, just simply thinking this just doesn't make sense. Like it simply doesn't a lot of the time. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of it for negatives. But I still think this is still one of my favorite games this year. But more, as I said, more on the lower end, unfortunately. And I do want to replay, and I do want to kind of like try it again. But um, I think if I get through it in a shorter time and kind of have more time to kind of like think about it and kind of like really kind of focus, like because like one thing is that when you're playing a game for the first time, you kind of sometimes it's about working out understanding things, and I it's not like I don't like difficulty in games, but it's when something is difficult because I feel like I'm getting hit and I'm like, how am I supposed to dodge this thing or how am I supposed to do that, you know. But when it's like, oh, it's difficult but I think I'm getting the hang of it, I just need to get better, that's when it's less annoying because you can kind of feel like the game is actually challenging you, kind of thing, because you know you're playing well enough to have made it as far as you have, and so it's weird for the game to suddenly be like, oh yeah, no, this, and it is. It's when something's so core to the gameplay in a way. Like there's not very much stealth overall, but the game kind of suggests that you can stealth a lot of the time when you can't, and then you sort of can, and it just doesn't have a very good flow. Um, but yeah, in terms of positives, as I said, I think the way that they kind of all of the rendition, like all the characters, are really cool, and I like Luis Serra was really cool. I thought he was just very, the way that they've kind of they integrate him more in the story this time around. They kind of gave him, I think, more of a role, and they kind of, you know, I don't know who his voice actor is. I think he is a much better character this time around, and they do the same with a couple of other characters. I won't say too much for the sake of spoilers. Um, and I remember a lot of controversy was around Ada and her voice actor or actress. Um, but I don't know, like I had no idea it was a different voice actress, and I'll be honest, other than a couple of lines that I think could have been delivered better, I don't see why people were having such a problem with her. I thought she was fine. Like, you know, I and I think in some ways I think people put too much focus on Resident Evil's voice actors and actresses like they're the best in the industry or something, and I just really I've always kind of found Resident Evil dialogue can be kind of hit and miss, if you know what I mean. Like some of it's really good, and some of it's like just not as good, or maybe the writing's not amazing. But generally, I thought it was good. But I was also like, but it's not like every character here is like super like amazing, like you know, super high quality. I'm like, I don't know why people are like taking so much offense, especially going out and attacking her and harassing her or whatever on Instagram, whatever it was. I just don't. I mean, that stuff is just you know unacceptable regardless of people's opinions. But yeah, just in terms of like what people thought, it baffles me honestly. But yeah, I really like the story. I really do enjoy like the gameplay, and I like the upgrading weapons, which is that's always my thing with survival horror games is that kind of whole flow of like the gameplay loop of like kind of playing, you know, you know, collecting ammo, scavenging for resources, and how do you get through further upgrading, and obviously the merchants back here. Um, and the way that they do this time around is really cool. They also had some interesting elements where they've got kind of like a almost like an RPG elements of like, oh, you have X, like you can find these attachments for your briefcase, and you can uh essentially um I guess it's like you get like 20% more chance for ammo to drop and things like that, and so yeah, there's some interesting new ideas there. The shooting range stuff is actually really difficult, and that like I managed to get like all I think S ranks and everything, which it's not. I didn't get everything done in the shooting range, but I got the trophy for it. But they were seriously difficult. I spent a lot of time trying to do those throughout. Um, but it's a really cool like that kind of sticks with the game's kind of the way it's kind of like it makes no sense that there's a shooting range down an elevator in the middle of this place, but that's what makes it so fun. It makes it so funny, and that's what Resident Evil 4 has a lot of. It's very like I said, it's very campy, it's very over the top, and that's why things like the knife parry and things like that were great additions. And when they work, and oftentimes, by the way, I should say it does work. Sorry, like the only times it really feels like it doesn't work is when it's a prompt, really. But otherwise, the knife parry was such a really just an insane addition, honestly. And I sort of it ties so well into the game. And I feel there was definitely. I think that what the original game had was that depending on where you shot enemies, you could like kick them, and that's how you did it. But in this one, it's like yeah, you can just like parry enemies with your knife, and it's ridiculous, but it feels really good to do. Um, and they keep a lot of that. One of the really cool actually I don't know if you'd call it. I guess you would call it like a mechanic. I guess in the old game was that like when you stun enemies and you kick them, and they go flying back, any enemies they knock into or catch on the way there, they also get either knocked over or stunned, and so it's this really good sense of like you feel like you're overwhelmed, but if you get that right, you can like kick over this entire crowd of like enemies, and it flows really well. Um, and just getting into a sort of spoiler territory, spoiler not so much story wise, but in terms of an enemy that you fight that is in the original that's also here. This version of the regenerators are pretty horrifying, honestly. I feel like they were significantly more scary in this game than they were in the original, and your first encounter with one of them is just I struggle with them honestly because you a lot of the time I still struggle with like how you fight them and stuff, but they really feel like just a really cool characters or like enemy design and extremely horrifying and scary and just scary not just from a visual standpoint, but just their entire idea of like regenerating health and these body parts and things. So it makes it really difficult to kind of uh fight back, and you kind of have to like that's why you have to get like the thermal scopes. You can actually like see the sort of like the parasites inside them, and you have to shoot them. And it's honestly when you get that, it's such a relief. But then you're like, oh, but now I need rifle ammo, and there's just some those enemies are really cool. Um, and honestly, the whole island section that they do right near the end is a lot of that kind of like last part of the game in the original. I thought really dragged, and it felt like the game was coming to a close, and then they threw in like this extra several hour thing, and I don't know if it was longer or about the same or less, but they definitely cut some stuff out in this remake towards the end, but it has a really good flow. Um, and yeah, and I think another thing to know is that like the boss fights are pretty cool overall. Though I think it's funny. I've always had a problem with like Resident Evil boss fights because they always feel really clunky. Like it's one of those I don't know how you would do it in a horror game. And Dead Space kind of does it, but Dead Space I think sort of makes it I don't say easy, but even Dead Space has a kind of a similar problem of like fighting a boss is like can be awkward because the movement doesn't because you feel like you need to move quicker kind of thing because your movement is obviously slower and the enemy moves quicker than you, and that's obviously part of the challenge. But sometimes it can feel a little bit it feels like the game has to be forgiving for it to be fun, if that makes sense. And no other game really falls into that. Like I think of like Final Fantasy's boss fights or even Devil May Cry and stuff like that. And while they're hack and slashes and sort of a lot more acrobatic and in the air, they can have super fast bosses, but it's a lot of that's down to your reflexes and your timing and dodging. Um, and I just find that you don't quite get the same freedom here, and that makes sense. But sometimes it can feel almost a detriment to the game, I think, because it kind of like I remember one of the boss fights in this. I think it only took me 2 or 3 attempts, but it felt like I could barely get a shot in on this enemy. It felt like I was always running away from them. And again, maybe that's just like a strategy thing. Maybe I wasn't using the right weapons. I don't know. But they just sometimes don't feel necessarily satisfying. And I think one other thing that doesn't help is that because you have no idea how much health they have, you're also, which I don't think you need to show how much health the enemy has. And there are signs when you're getting towards the end, like you can kind of know because like the dial. I think there's more and more dialogue that kind of goes on as you get through to the end. So there are signs, but it sometimes feels a bit kind of like you're very much in the dark, and I guess that maybe that's kind of what makes it is, maybe that's what people like from the game. But I sometimes just I wasn't particularly a huge fan of that. But in terms of visuals and spectacle and everything, these boss fights are really cool, particularly the last boss. And there's a lot of like iconic moments from the original that have kind of made it across here. The only thing that the game doesn't have is the Separate Ways DLC, which I never played in the original, but I'm curious to know if that's, I think that's what a lot of people are sort of waiting for, where you play as Ada and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. I spoke a lot longer on that than I anticipated. But and I think, I mean, and now I'm looking at it's like 36 minutes in. I might have to break this into two parts as well, which sounds like, oh, you're doing this again, but it's more like, well, I ultimately, like, it's what I was saying at the beginning. This is totally off on a tangent, but I wanted to record this when I'd finished Final Fantasy 16, and since I haven't finished it and this is going as long as it is right now, I'm almost like maybe it is. But this is breaking this into two parts maybe feels like it's not something that is the greatest thing to do. It's just sort of like I would like to give a proper opinion on Final Fantasy 16, but I wanted to record this. And so looking at where we're at now, it's also like a lot of these games I haven't actually had a chance to properly speak about yet. So a lot of this is like my chance to, and I think after this and the next part will be pretty much up to date, and from then on it'll just be kind of thinking of like new things I can talk about. So a lot of these are sort of almost recapping what I've played, and I sort of did that in the first What I'm Playing episode, where I spoke about a bunch of different games I've been playing. Um, but yeah, we're doing it here instead, sort of thing. So yeah, so that's the Resident Evil. There's obviously a lot more I could say, but I think that'll be something I want to revisit when I eventually replay it. Moving on to a totally different game. This actually might be, I don't know where I'd put it in a ranking for this year, but because I haven't played that much of this, but Octopath Traveler 2 really captured me when I played it, way more than I had anticipated it doing. And I think one of the biggest things that really got me into the game was the art style, which is dubbed HD 2D, and essentially it's basically like pixel art but with realistic lighting, and it kind of makes it look a cross between like a if you want to call it modern. It's sort of it puts it in between kind of like, oh, it's like a modern game, but it's in terms of like graphics, but it's also it keeps that pixel art style, that kind of makes it feel like it's an old game at the same time, and it's a really cool combination, and it looks beautiful. I just honestly love how this art style looks, and I think it was in. So there's a game coming out soon called Sea of Stars that has a similar style, not to the same degree, I don't think, but it's has certain elements like that. But uh, games like the original Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy, I believe, also have this kind of art style. And yeah, it's kind of this is a game that I've not really I've not really played before. Like I've played certain games like it, but it's certainly not like an isometric JRPG of this kind, with pixel art and everything like that. But there is a lot I like about this, and I'd never played the first, so this is my first Octopath Traveler, and of course, I just it was the art style that kind of got me into it, and so yeah, the whole idea of this is obviously Octopath Traveler. I think both with the first and the second, it's an isometric JRPG with obviously these pixel art characters you play as. And this also it's obviously like pixel art style and all that. Um, but you essentially play as one of these 8 characters, and they each have their own story and like abilities and play style, and they have their own like motivations, and that ties into their story. And you essentially pick one of those to play as to start with. Um, but as you move through the world and as you kind of explore, you end up encountering the other characters, and when you do, it gives you the opportunity to not only add them to your party, but it also lets you play their opening stories, and then it acts from that point on. I think acts like a quest sort of thing. So it acts as like a, you know, oh, you've got two different characters. You can do their story, or you can do your story. And the way I was playing it was that I played. I don't know if it was like a samurai, but there was one particular character in the second game that I was playing as that was from like a, you think of like Oriental, like China or Japan or something like that, who was, there's a really like interesting story and a lot of interesting themes that are going on there, and that's kind of like the character I side with. But then I encountered like someone who's like a, you call him like an apothecary, who's like kind of like she's like a, she's a, what do you, like a nurse kind of thing, and obviously makes potions and things like that, and she's obviously like the healer of the group. That then and I met like a merchant guy who's very good at, like, he can hire, like, some of his abilities are that he will hire other NPCs that can kind of help you in fights and stuff. And then each of those, outside of combat, each of those have an ability, like a passive ability that you can use in the open world, both in the morning and at night. And that kind of unlocks different, like features and opportunities that you can kind of do to, like, find out information, or you can buy items, and that whole day and night cycle is actually like part of the game's mechanic. And so uh that actually was like kind of advertised to me when you first load up the game. When I first loaded up the game, it's the same for everyone, but the menu you get to really took me back, because not only has it got this incredible theme, I think the music of this game so far has been just incredible. I just love them. I mean, I am a sucker for a good soundtrack, but this game I was like, wow, this is not the kind of music I expected. But again, it's like I'm kind of new to these games, so it's sort of not really, a lot of it's not what I expected, or a lot of it's kind of new to me. And you start it up and you get this like really amazing music that's kind of like showing you bits of different gameplay in different areas throughout the game. And you can press, I think it's triangle maybe, and it flicks between day and night. But that also changes the music as well. And it's this really, when you talk about a vibe, that's what this game's menu is. And that's actually something that doesn't get spoken about a lot. But the main menu of a game is, I think, integral to like setting up what the adventure you're about to go on. And there are some really boring menus out there, and then there are some really cool menus. Like, I think like Ratchet and Clank on like PS2, that has like Ratchet working on his ship or something just as the main menu, and you press start and then you kind of get into it. Um, and then there's some main menus that are just, simple and sort of basic. And this game kind of airs on that side of just being very inventive. Uh, and then obviously, as I found out, that day and night cycle was actually a core mechanic to the game, and essentially that the time of day changes what's going on in the world. It changes the passive ability you can use during that particular moment. And I believe it's also, enemies are more tougher in the evenings or at night. And so, and it's kind of weird because like the time of day progresses normally on its own, so you can just leave it, but you can also just swap it back whenever you want. Which I do find it a little bit of a strange thing, because it's almost like essentially saying like, oh, so like, it's, I guess it's only the option, but it's also like whenever it's nighttime, it's like, oh, I just want it to be daytime. I don't want, oh, this enemy's difficult. Let me go back. And I don't know how I feel, because it feels a bit weird, but I also like that it's also doesn't force you into like, because if it's like, you might be like, oh, it's nighttime, I don't want to fight difficult enemies now. Um, but you'll see, and it's what the main menu shows you, is that different things are going on at night, and different things are going on in the day. And so you kind of, it's almost like every area has like, it's worth going back through at daytime and at nighttime, because you never know what might be going on or what you might find. Um, and yeah, so this one is like, I haven't got too much to say. Like, the combat, I should say the combat's really interesting as well, because the way it's set up, you essentially, you can empower your abilities. So like every turn you kind of go through, you get like another charge that lets you empower your abilities essentially. And it's obviously turn-based combat, and a lot of it's trying to figure out the enemy's weaknesses and then using that against them. And obviously that's kind of based on your party's kind of makeup, as like what abilities your party has. And that's been like a fun thing of like trying to learn, oh, this enemy's weak to ice, or this enemy's weak to spears, kind of thing. And you obviously have different damage types. You have like, blunt weapons and sharp weapons and things like that. And then the same with elements and things like that. And then each character has its own kind of like ultimate ability or whatever, but then they can, as I said, with those charges, well, they have like abilities, and then they have like, I think like an ultimate kind of like super, ability that's like, when you, I think it's, I don't know if it's like a number of turns or it's when you hit like a certain criteria. I can't remember, but essentially it's like it does a lot of damage. I think one of them, if it's the healer, she might have the ability to like heal the party or something like that. I don't remember entirely. But obviously, each character has their own, uh, you know, abilities and things like that. And I remember one of the last things I did, I met this sort of character that I don't know if he could be part of your party or not, but there were things you could unlock. I think there were like gear pieces essentially that would give you extra abilities in combat or extra and things like that. Oh, that was it, yeah, because there's jobs in the game, right? And so as you unlock jobs, you can every character has their own assigned like job. So I think mine might be warrior because he's obviously like the samurai guy or whatever. And I think the merchant might just be something like merchant. But I found something that's like inventor, and what you can actually do is you can like literally on the fly, you can like basically invent these machines that just do tons of damage. And I was really shocked though because it kind of felt like it was making it a bit trivial. But that was obviously like an NPC that I met in the world that I could interact with, and there were these things I could go and sort of craft with them, and then that would allow me to have all these different abilities. Um, and that I only got one of those, I think, before when I last played. I think I've only played like 5, maybe 10-ish hours of the game, but I really do want to go back to this. No, I mean, I don't think I can really say too much, but the soundtrack as well, like that is one of the many reasons I want to go back because I just sort of, much like I've sort of said in the past, I prefer playing games and listening to the soundtrack firsthand that way rather than listening to the soundtrack and then going back to it. Um, but yeah, it's just a really like almost endearing game that's just not what I typically play, but it looks so amazing. It has this really nice. It's a very chill game at the same time. Some of the fights you could say get a bit repetitive, but I think that's just kind of the game. And there's a lot of like XP grinding and stuff. Well, I wouldn't say there's a lot of XP grinding, but there's a lot of like fighting enemies, doing things to sort of get your XP up. But it was way more expansive than I had anticipated. But I really didn't know much about this game, honestly. Like going into it, I was like, I know the art style. I like at the menu, I was like, oh, the music sounds good, but I didn't realize it was as expansive and like a proper JRPG, which is probably just me being ignorant, really. But yeah, it's one I really want to get back to, and I don't know when I'll get back to it, honestly. But it's one of those that I think if you're playing on Switch, actually, this is a very good Switch game. It's just a very cozy, nice for a portable kind of thing. I was playing on PS5, but actually, is it? Yeah, it was the PS5 version I was playing, and I think it is on PS4 as well. It's on PS4, PS5, and Switch, and I think maybe PC. Um, but yeah, just a really cool game, and I'm really looking forward to when I go back to it. And I think this has been a surprise kind of hit for me this year, and I think much of that is due to its visuals and its overall tone and style, but that not only got me into the game, but it also was just something that became even better the more I saw in all these environments. I was like, I couldn't believe how amazing everything looked. Um, but yeah, that's all I've got to say on that for now. But as I said, I've not finished it, and maybe that's not great to say for a favorite game of the year or whatever. But I just think that this game really did strike me, And again, I guess I'm saying these are my favorite games of the year, not so much saying that it's like, oh, I'm definitely going to include them in the game of the year list. These are just the ones that kind of like stood out most to me, or maybe the ones I've got to say most about. Like maybe I seemed critical of Resident Evil 4 a minute a bit ago, but it wasn't I didn't like it. I sort of like, I wouldn't say that was a bad game. I just don't think it's. I was surprised that not that they got tons of great reviews. I actually haven't seen many people's reviews. I'd be curious to know what the general consensus is in regards to some of what I've said, if other people said those issues. Um, but I know that a lot of people like it'll be classed as like one like a really good remake. But in a lot of ways, I thought Resident Evil 2 remake was better than 4. It just felt more polished and more focused and less had less issues, but at the same time, Resident Evil 2 is doing less than 4, and I think I technically prefer 4. Well, I think 2 is like a better game, but I think I prefer 4 because of the weapon upgrades. Anyway, that's talking about Resident Evil again, and we're talking about Octopath Traveler 2, where I'm wrapping it up. Uh, but yeah, definitely recommend. I mean, I actually don't know what makes JRPG great, honestly. Like, so this is kind of my first foray into it, and with playing Final Fantasy 16, I'm kind of thinking about going back to Final Fantasy 1 with the pixel remasters, maybe playing 1 through 6. If not, I want to try out Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 7, sorry, Final Fantasy 7 on like the PS1 port that's on PS4 as well. So it's kind of, this might have been my first proper foray into the genre, I think, and I've played games like it. and like I've played turn-based games, things like that, but not really a JRPG of this kind. And yeah, there's just something really, really captivating about this game. I just think is truly amazing, honestly. So yeah, so moving on, what I'm going to do is I am going to split this into two parts, because ideally I want these episodes to be about an hour long, and I think that looking at the games I've still got to talk about, I could possibly go on for much longer, and I think that this will give me the chance to talk about uh, Final Fantasy 16 at some point in a much greater capacity than I currently can do. Rather than just drop again, rather than trying to rush everything in or make this like a 2 hour episode. It's already getting late today, which means hopefully I can get this out today. I think if not, it'll go out on Saturday. I'm still, again, this whole schedule's still up in the air, but that's enough for the tangents again. So the last game I will talk about here is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Uh, so I played Jedi Fallen Order for the first time this year. I beat and platinum the game in a week, and I I kind of like as I was nearing like close to the 100% finish mark on Fallen Order, I started to look at some of the trailers and stuff more for Survivor. Not I'd already seen the trailers already, but I kind of looked into them and I didn't realize how big of a jump it was like graphically, and I was like, oh wow, there's a lot of new stuff here, and that was like immediately um, evident to me as soon as I started Jedi Survivor. There was this real sense of much like how going from like Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2 is, where you pick up however many years later and you're in a situation like, wait, how are we here? What's going on? And it really throws you into it straight away. And obviously, you'll know if you played the intro of Jedi Survivor how it starts. Um, and that really it immediately got me hooked, and it got me excited to play the game because I was like, man, this is I really enjoyed the story of the first game. I'm really excited to see where these characters are going. This is probably the most excited I was for anything Star Wars related ever. So this was it's really cool, like feeling going into it. And I think overall the story, like that praise only continued because the story just got better and the characters just continued to be great. And again, the voice acting and everything was just yeah, again, the story has some really cool twists and turns, and all of what I liked about the first game in terms of story kind of continued here. Uh, and that was like to me, I think the story is probably the standout aspect of this game. Uh, which kind of I like coming away from the story because I don't want there's not really too much to say about the story. I don't think because again, without spoiling anything, there are a couple of moments where I wasn't particularly like story wise I wasn't too fond of what happened. I guess I'll say one of them. It is a spoiler, um, but again, so I skipped I don't know like a bit like I don't know in 2 minutes or something, but I don't know, but maybe not. um, Essentially, so again, spoilers if you've not played Jedi Survivor. You fight uh Darth Vader shows up basically, and you fight him as Seer, and again, spoilers just to 100% confirm, but Seer, she gets killed by Darth Vader. And there's a reason why that all happens, and that's kind of the driver. The driver of why that happened and how that happened is the reason why you're seeking revenge after that point, and that's going after this other character who I won't say who, but to me that having Darth Vader show up and suddenly kill a character to me was kind of frustrating because the thing is right is that I think this is where like the more nuance comes in about Darth Vader and his place in the overall films, because he again it's been a while since I watched those films, but he obviously being Anakin was essentially possessed and controlled by Palpatine through the dark side or whatever, and he was essentially misled, and so he was sent out, and sure he killed all these Jedi and things like that, but that was at the not only request but also the control essentially of Palpatine, and to kind of do that here felt weird because like there was part of me that's like, well, we're not going to get revenge on Darth Vader. We're not going to say, but then it's like, but then do we want revenge on Darth Vader? It's kind of one of those that it makes it very complex, but it also kind of bothers me because I'm like, you've killed off one of my favorite characters, who isn't in this game as much, unfortunately. Um, and it felt a little bit like it wasn't fully earned, kind of thing. It was a really cool fight, but it just felt like I knew where it was going. Like I just I knew it was going to happen, and seeing it happen, just I was like, I was kind of pissed off for a while because I didn't. It bothered me because I knew I just had this gut feeling. I was like, I know what's going to happen here, and it kind of it was a shame because just before that I was like really high on the game. I was like, man, this game's so awesome, these characters and everything, and then that happened, and I was just like, I don't know about that. And obviously that's when you kind of go, and I think the story almost goes a bit off rails at that point a little bit, much like Cal does as well with his kind of turn to the again I won't say too much, but the just it feels a little bit weird after that point. It makes sense why, um, but overall it kind of felt like, and I'll get more into it a bit later, but I just like the variety of locations was not particularly great in this game, I don't think. But I'll get into that in a little bit. But first, I just want to talk about the combat because the combat here had been deepened more than it was in the first game, with by giving you different stances that were essentially dependent on like the kind of lightsaber you were using. Uh, so at first I was like, oh, these they felt like they were impressive, and it was cool giving you access to these different abilities. But the thing that really kind of surprised me was that you could literally only swap between two of them at one time, and I was like thinking this doesn't really make sense because I think the game could have gone further than this, and it would have made more sense just logically, right? And it's like what I mean by that is all of the stances are tied to Cal's lightsaber. So, for example, if you're using the single blade lightsaber and then you swap to the double ended one, he'll kind of like pull out the other one and put it together as something the double ended one. But then if you were to like use the double ended one and the dual blade, he'll just pull them apart and use them. And then if you were to use the blaster with the blade, he'll just have one of them out and then the blaster. And then you've got the crossguard, which is just like an extra attachment to it. And so I understand there being stances, but limiting you to two doesn't really make sense because theoretically, Cal should be able to swap to any of these at any point. And that felt like they could have gone crazy with the combat, and they didn't. And I think one other thing is that the combat feels kind of clunky. And I don't know if it was in the first game. It definitely was a bit clunky in the first game, but it almost felt maybe a bit worse here. Like it felt less satisfying to play. And I was really kind of surprised because I thought that, and what doesn't help is that they have a lot of pretty bad performance issues with like stuttering and screen tearing, which I think a lot of that might be fixed now. I don't know, but when I first played, it was really bad. I think this is one of the worst performing games I've played in a while, and I saw a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's not that bad on PS5; it's bad on PC." And I'm like, "No, this was bad. This was one of the worst. It might be the single worst game I've played performance-wise ever. Like Final Fantasy 16 has issues, but it is not on the level of Star Wars Jedi Survivor. The experience technically playing this game was just terrible, honestly, and it's really awful that they decided to ship the game like that. 100% they should have given it more, and that doesn't help how the combat felt. Uh, but yeah, the combat itself has this weird thing where it's like it's obviously trying to be like a Souls, like it's trying to be difficult, and that's why you got the difficulty levels, and that's kind of what the first game emulated a little bit. But I also feel like it could deepen more and it could become almost like a more character action style, like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta or even more recently Final Fantasy 16. And I think that that would be a better direction and, while giving you more of these options with the different type of lightsabers, because it kind of feels like with how almost janky it feels, I don't know, like I just think it would make more sense as a more hack and slash style gameplay. And I don't know if they would change that for the third game, but I just don't it the thing that makes like Dark Souls and Elden Ring great in how they play is it's the flow they have. Like they flow really well with your dodging, with your blocks and things like that. And this game just doesn't feel like it has very good flow. It feels very like you said, not very satisfying. It feels like attacks are quick. Sometimes it feels like they don't hit enemies. It feels like sometimes the wind up, like the crossguard attack wind up, is like really long, and there's just a lot of strange kind of things about it, and it just feels like it's almost like you've got all this potential for where you can take the game combat wise, and yet it feels like you're hampering yourself by trying to keep it in this certain style. And I think that if they could just polish that a little bit more, and make it play better essentially. And that's kind of a shame because like the combat obviously takes up a large amount of the game, but it just never it just felt constantly throughout the entire game. It just felt a bit sort of, like I said, clunky and just didn't quite feel like it could flow as well as it could, and that's a shame because I think the first game had that problem, but it kind of you could get through it and it still played mostly okay. But this game feels like it's even more like janky and quick. Like your attacks sometimes are quicker than even you can comprehend. Sometimes it's like, wait, why am I attacking this fast? Why is there's a lot of loss in like the way that the animations play and everything's built up, and even the dodging. You dodge, and it's more like this weird jump to the side, but it's not like a jump. Like it doesn't. It doesn't. It just the way it feels. It feels almost disconnected from the controls a little bit. And I think this combat was actually a pretty big letdown considering what they could have done. Um, but it is like the story was that standout thing for me, and that was kind of the thing that really kind of wanted me to keep going. And it was. I mean, it was straight away the combat. I was like, man, this again starting out visually, story wise. I was like, man, this is really awesome. But then as soon as you get into the combat, I was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. This doesn't quite feel as good as I wish it did. And so beyond the combat, I sort of alluded to it earlier, but in terms of like the when I was talking about the story, but I feel like the game has, along with the combat not feeling great, I feel like there's some sort of not great, sort of things that I didn't quite like, and one of those is obviously the sort of story point I mentioned earlier, but also I think one of the biggest issues, and I was really shocked by this, is the variety of locations in this game are extremely limited. You know, and what's a shame is that the one that is probably the most wild and new for the compared for compared to Fallen Order is like the smallest in the game, and it's the first one you go to, and I really was kind of disappointed in this because the first game does alright by giving you access to like 4 or 5 different planets, but you get and you get a decent amount of variety from them. You kind of get the forests, you get like a snowy area place, and that well, not that that was particularly big, but you still get a lot of things to explore and a lot of different visuals and different kind of locations and different areas within those. Like there's Empire bases on Kashyyyk, and I think there's also I think it's a Kashyyyk. There's one on there. Yeah, it's like and then you've got some like underground areas. There's a lot of different areas you can go to, but with Survivor like there are those in them, but it seems to put more focus on the idea of having these like one or two big maps and having a lot of different places you can go within them. And I just think that was not the play because I feel like part of what made the first game cool was that exploration and going to those different planets and seeing what's out there, especially the first planet, which I guess I can. It's not like a spoiler because it's literally the first one you go to and it's in the trailers. But Coruscant is one that and they said earlier, they said before the game came out, like, oh, you can go there, but you can't really explore much. And they said, I'll say something along those lines. And I was really shocked that the game took place in so many similar locations. And what's frustrating is, and this is a bit of a spoiler for the end, so you just skip ahead like 20 or 30 seconds or whatever. But the whole story revolves around you getting to this place, which I've totally forgotten the name of now. It's oh man, what is it? Tanalor, I think is the name. And your whole game is revolving around like getting there, and you get there, and it looks just like the areas you've been to. And it's very the desert focus is like this whole sandy desert thing they seem to love in this game, and I really don't understand why. And I don't know if that's a COVID limitation, whether they were just like, oh, because they did make this game in 3 years, which is really impressive, or about 3 years, um, just over 3 years, I think, which is really impressive. But I say it's impressive, but then you look at something like the combat, and it feels like that was kind of janky. It feels like the location variety felt like so there's things like that I'm like, I almost wish it didn't come out. Like I wish they'd kind of like restructured things and spent more time on these other things, and especially launching in the state they did, which was just terrible, honestly. Um, and yeah, and so that really was really frustrating because I was waiting. I was like playing the entire. As I was playing the game, I was like, "Come on, like you've got to give me." And when I got to go to a new place, I was like, "Thank God, right, cool, we're finally going to a new place." And you go there, and it's like, "Okay, it's this space mining facility place." I'm like, "Okay, this is okay, I suppose." And then it's like you go back and you spend more story in these existing places, and then you finally and there are some like very different areas. Like there's some almost like towards the end of the game. I won't say too much again, but there's some cool areas that you go to that are quite different to the general areas you've been to in that on that particular planet. But it still feels like they just could have gone further with it, kind of thing. Um, and so yeah, that was I think the variety of locations is probably my biggest critique because like the story was pretty good overall. It had some really cool twists. I really like the voice acting, the characters, the cutscenes, all of that was just again really high quality. What Fallen Order had, And not including the performance issues. But I could handle the combat. I was like, the combat was not great, but I was like, whatever. Like it's just how it is, sort of thing. And I wasn't playing on the hardest setting, which I think on the hardest setting that would be. And by the way, that's another thing. Some of the challenge, there was one challenge I did that I remember watching a friend stream doing it, and it was on the hard. He was playing on the hardest setting, and it looked really just not fun at all. And I tried doing it on normal, and I struggled with it. And it's just the way that the enemies you have to fight, and the way that just the way that all their attacks just do not gel with each other. It felt like a really unbalanced thing. That there's just a lot of this game that comes across maybe a little bit rushed, I think, or that it didn't quite get the time it needed. But then at the same time, you've got a lot of other side content. Like, again, I keep trying to, don't want to spoil, but there's a lot of cool side quests and characters you encounter, and you can grow your own flowers and stuff back at the sort of restaurant or whatever the place is. I've forgotten its name now. Um, and so there's a lot of like post game and sort of side quests kind of like stuff that you can do that really feels like this game is very dense, has a lot in it. But yet when it comes to variety of locations and stuff like that, it feels like it's missing something, honestly. See, I think I would still rate this fairly highly this year, I think, but that is sort of I don't know, like it's certainly not. It might be top three, like because when I played that, I really did enjoy it, but when I finished it, I was like wasn't too sure, but I sort of still would rate it fairly high. I think at least if we, I mean, what there's seven games here, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. Well, I guess eight. Obviously, I'm only talking about four here, four on the next one. I think out of those, you may be looking at four or five ranking wise. But in yeah, as much as I like it, or as much as I like a lot of its different things that it does, I almost feel like the game as a whole maybe feels like a bit of a step back from Fallen Order, which wasn't what I thought when I first played it. Because when I started, I was like, oh man, this is, you can tell we are flying now. Bigger budget, way more stuff. There's like Coruscant is awesome. When I got to Coruscant for the first time, I was like, I don't think I've played a game until now that feels this next gen. And besides all the performance issues, obviously, but in terms of visuals, I was like, man, this, and especially when it runs at 60 and it looks that good, I was like, this is incredible. Um, but yeah, I think we'll leave it there for now. For now, this will be, as I said, this was originally meant to be 1 hour on 8 games, ended up being 1 hour on 4 games, or over 1 hour on 4 games. And I think that's fine though, because like it gives me more time to kind of formulate thoughts on Final Fantasy 16. But I do apologize because I've promised this, and then it's kind of been like I've almost like piecemealed this. This was meant to be one episode from last week's, and this one, and the next part. But it's now basically become 3 hours. But it's me also catching up on stuff that I haven't spoken about yet, really. So yeah, we'll leave it here. I appreciate you for listening and everything. Leave any comments, questions, or any of your thoughts on any of these games discussed in the comments below. Let me know what you think, and I will see you on the next episode, which will probably be next week now. So have a good one, and ciao, ciao, ciao.